Welcome to Rethinking Communication. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore how we better connect with each other through the power of our words. For most of us, formal education left gaps in our ability to communicate well with each other, especially when trying to navigate conflict, inspire change, and overcome misunderstandings. I'm a former journalist, a speaking coach, and a communication expert, and my goal is to encourage you to rethink what it means to be an effective communicator, from the stage to the meeting room to the living room and everywhere in between. I recently deleted almost all social media off my phone. I only really have two social media apps on my phone these days. One is Instagram, and I pretty much use it for boring, mindless scrolling. And for that, I'm trying to get that down. I'm trying to reduce the amount of time that I'm spending even doing something like that. Seriously considering deleting Instagram altogether. So even that might be on the chopping block. And then the only other one that I have is LinkedIn. I have LinkedIn for networking, for people that are in my sphere that I like to stay connected to, where I like to share a lot of ideas that I share here on the podcast or that I share in my newsletter, the follow-up, or in the articles on my website. LinkedIn is really the place that I go when I want to actually, quote unquote, be social or use a social media app in its intended way. I'm active, I should say, on LinkedIn. And recently I wrote a post on LinkedIn that, for me anyway, went quote unquote viral. I don't post a lot of stuff that gets a huge following on there, but this particular post got a lot of engagement, a lot of interaction, and I think it's because it struck at a chord with people that I'm hoping, or at least thinking in my mind, gave voice to a lot of things that people are feeling out there. And so I want to take this post from LinkedIn and here on the podcast, share it and expand on it as I try to bring some words to what you might be feeling in this particular moment of our history. As I record this in late January 2025, no matter when you're listening to this, I think this can bring some clarity and perhaps a little bit of direction with what you might be feeling with all that is going on in the world. And that's where I want to start. That phrase, with all that is going on in the world. That phrase is actually what got me thinking about this post, because at its core, what I posted, the first line of my post on LinkedIn was, humans were not designed to know all that we know, and it's crushing our ability to communicate well with each other and affect positive change. When we think about all that we know these days, and why I started this episode and this particular topic talking about social media, we have access to the world's information in ways that we have never had as human beings. And it's often just looked at as a net positive. Perhaps in many ways it is, perhaps understanding more and getting more of an input or glimpse into the ways that the world works, or the plight or troubles or successes and brilliance of more of the world brings us closer together, reduces the lines of friction between sharing information. Surely a lot of good has come out of that. But rarely, at least in my estimation, have we taken a step back and looked at what having access to all that information has done for us and to us. And I know a lot has been written about people having access into people's lives, especially in teenagers, for teenagers. When we talk about, gosh, as myself, as a 40-year-old right now, if I think back what social media would have been like when I was a teenager, how difficult that would have been, how just managing social media and friendship groups online versus in person, how much difficult, or what layer that would have added. Maybe it wouldn't have been difficult. I don't know. I don't have that experience. I can certainly go ask my kids, but I really don't let them have much social media. So, but I'm talking more about just the flood of information that we are subject to day in and day out. The instant access to the goings on of the entire planet that when you take a step back and go back 100 years, that wasn't possible. It wasn't possible to collect that information in one place, let alone be able to consume it and read it and see it in any sort of timely manner. I'm not asking us to go back 100 years. This is not a yearning for the quote unquote good old days. I'm just saying this is a new phenomenon where at the time I wrote this post, and I can even think of examples from today, within an hour of waking up today, or on this particular day that I wrote this post, I learned of an earthquake in Tibet. I learned of Meta's decision to end fact checking across its sites and its platforms. And I learned of a wide receiver's decision to choose to play football at Oregon rather than my alma mater, Kansas State, which of course greatly affected me because I love college football. But if I think about today, within an hour of getting on Instagram and doing a couple scrolls, even within a few minutes of that, for example, I learned of not even a close acquaintance, a loose acquaintance of mine. I learned of her father's last few dying days and how he's still with us physically, but mentally he's not. I had this overwhelming rush over me. Like, should I know this? Should I have this window into this person's life? Like I said, loose acquaintance. We've only met in person twice. We're connected on social media because that's just kind of what you do these days, or that's the assumed what you do these days, right? I don't know her well. I don't know her family. I certainly don't know her father, but I now know a very intimate detail about what she's going through, what her family's going through, and her life that in years past, before all of this, I would never have had that window into her life. Now, had I let it, any of those things I talked about, the earthquake in Tibet, Meta's decision, all that stuff, these bits of information could have consumed not only my thoughts, but also my actions. And for many people, and certainly for me at times as well, that could have potentially derailed my morning workout. It could have derailed time with my kids before they went off to school, or my morning reading and prayer time, the things I can control. Had I let those things, my mind could have been consumed and I could have gone down the rabbit hole of just getting more information, taking in more, and not really having anything to do with it, not having anything to act upon. It's just the consumption and the overwhelm of news and information that I ultimately have no effect, one way or the other, on what happens next. I can't control Mark Zuckerberg and what he chooses to do with his social media platforms. I can't control anything that happens in Tibet when an earthquake happens. Now, you can make the argument I can donate to the Red Cross and the people who are on the ground. Yes, there are ways that I can, by proxy, have an effect, but me directly have an effect unless I decide I'm going to get on a flight and go to Tibet to help. It's out of my control. Certainly a college football player's decision on where to play football, not in my control in the least. But with the access to information that we have, and by extension, our often unfiltered exposure to people's once private thoughts and emotions, like that acquaintance of mine, we have, in effect, inverted Stephen Covey's circle of control, influence, and concern. Now, I want to explain what this is. I was recently introduced to the circle of control, influence, and concern by a TEDx speaker that I was helping coach for a TEDx Boulder Salon. She is a professor at the University of Colorado. Her name's Olga Hansen, and she introduced this circle to me, and it's stuck with me. It's stuck with me. Stephen Covey introduced this circle of control, influence, and concern in his book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I've never read this book, but this framework or this circle makes me want to, because it's a model that provides a way to think about your energy and your focus in addressing the things that you have access to, the information swirling around you. And from what I understand, Stephen Covey was using it as a way to promote personal responsibility and empowerment. So let's go through this. In the very innermost circle, you have the circle of control. This is the smallest one. It's right there in the middle, and it contains the things that you have direct control over. You have direct control every single day over your thoughts, your words, your choices, your actions, your reactions. I believe it was Viktor Frankl that said something to the effect of, in between stimulus and response is the space to decide what your response will be, something to that effect. I'm sorry, I butchered that one, but we have the ability in between the stimulus and our response to decide how we're going to respond. That's within our control. So personal choices, responses to situation, our own health habits and choices. This circle, as I understand it, this is the personal accountability that you have direct control over. All right. Now, outward from that, we have the circle of influence. So, circle of control is the middle of the target, so to speak. The next layer out from that is the circle of influence. This represents the concerns over which a person can have some influence. They have some aspect of ability to create at least some type of movement, some type of positive step in a direction where their actions, their words, their behavior, that can create a ripple effect or an impact, but you don't have direct control. So your relationships, your workplace dynamics, if you're part of a team, how your team performs, you can have influence there. This is your family, your friends, your finances, a promotion at work. You have influence there. You don't have control, perhaps, probably not. Your work environment, you get to influence that, how you show up. Voting is a way to influence, right? You can influence even the future by your actions today. But again, those actions are what you control. You do not control the future. You only have influence over it. And finally, we have the outermost ring of this circle, which is the broadest one. It includes everything a person cares about or worries about. It encompasses a wide range of issues. This is called the circle of concern. This is global events like an earthquake in Tibet. This is other people's behavior. This is distant future uncertainties, things like climate change, the weather, things like what's going on in the news, the economy, war and foreign politics, natural disasters, the past, our regrets, the opinions of others, online trolls. Many items in this circle, as you might expect, they are of concern to us, but they are out of our control and even our influence. And so when we hyperfixate on these things, the things we are concerned about yet cannot control, and we fail to see the opportunities directly in front of us that exist much closer to us and that our words and actions can directly affect, you begin to see the problem with the information overload that we have and why I stated that we were not designed to know all that we know. And when we fixate on that, that the fact that it is even there, it's crushing our ability to communicate well with each other. And to understand not just that we can affect positive change, but even understand the avenues and the areas of life and the world around us where we can. With this overwhelming access to information, with this deluge of instant access to the goings on of people that you barely know, or in many cases do not know at all, where you have absolutely zero control or influence, hyperfixating on that, you begin to focus your attention on those areas of concern. When you let it, when it has unfiltered access to your mind, you begin to focus on the areas of concern. So when this happens, you start to see things like friendships vaporized in an instant because of a social media post, where rather than leaning on the things that we know about this person, perhaps it is an actual friendship, but because they're posting about something that you disagree with, about something that you have no control or influence over. Let's just use the topic of climate change. I've seen it. I've seen social media posts like that, or politics, or something of a social nature vaporize a friendship because we decided that we're going to care more about the things that we're concerned about rather than the things that we have control and influence over. We have control over our thoughts, our ideas, our emotions, our actions, our words. We have influence, of course, over our friendships. Now, the platform of where we have that level of influence changes. Do we have influence on X or Facebook or LinkedIn or Instagram? And is that the same level of influence that we might have with a friend who we meet for coffee to create a dialogue around, to ask questions of that person about that social media post that was concerning? But if I go back to Aiden Nepom from a few episodes ago when she said, our goal should be to protect the friendship first. Far too often, I'm seeing friendships go completely off the rails and thrown aside because we're not willing to protect the friendship first, where we have control and influence. We focus all our attention on those areas that we have merely concern. When this circle is inverted again, and we continue to focus on the areas of concern rather than control and influence, we see an addiction to news content, to doom scrolling social media, to participating in online trolling. And look, when I say news content, I'm being very specific here. I'm a former journalist. I've made that very clear here on the show. Much of what is packaged as news today is actually entertainment. It's specifically designed to get a response out of you. And we know studies have proven this, that negative responses, that's the goal, because that actually drives higher engagement. So we're going, this quote unquote news content is actually trying to make you feel bad, trying to get you angry, trying to get you upset, trying to get you to lash out, trying to get you into these behaviors of doom scrolling and online trolling, because that generates more engagement. And when that happens, you are a pawn in the game. You are feeding into the exact behavior that crushes your ability to communicate well and realize what you are in control of and what you can influence. And all you're doing is focusing on what you are concerned about, yet you have little to no ability to affect change. When this happens, you start to see a loss of hope, a loss of belief that what you say and do matters. You begin to think, or you begin to give up your ability to believe that you have autonomy as a human being to make decisions, to affect change in the positive, to see the world become something that you want it to be. And when I say the world, I'm actually talking about your world, not the world, big W, everyone on earth, all the things that we're talking about in terms of areas of our concern. The thing that has happened for me, as I mentioned earlier, when I deleted things off of social media, and I don't watch the news on TV, I maybe go to news websites once a week just to check in and headline skim a little bit, just to see what's out there. But you know what happened when I deleted social media? Not a lot changed. And that's a good thing. And here's what I mean. Rather than spending cycles and hours and all of my brain space thinking about how my world might change because this political decision was made, or this thing happened over here, or this person's running for office, or this ordinance or this law, or this person said this on X, or this person said this on the news last night. All of it stopped. It shut off. And you know how it affected me? It affected me zero. I take that back. I'm no longer concerned about those things, so I can just be in the headspace of where I'm at home, with my family, with my children, with my wife, with my friends, with my coworkers at work. I can just be there, and it's okay that I don't know the personal, intimate details of how they believe socially or politically, or their thoughts about this latest article that came out. I just don't care about any of it. I also want to caveat this with, I understand that I've got some level of ability as a white man to do that. And I'm probably, let's not probably, I'm not going to be affected in the ways many other disadvantaged or minority communities might be. I get that. I understand that. I realize it. But what I am saying is that even in those instances, I still think it behooves you to focus on your areas of control and influence first, because that's where actual change is going to happen if it happens at all. Again, when we hyperfixate on this, all of this information that we have, when this happens, you see careers upended in response to misunderstandings and conflict. The story that you begin to tell yourself about coworkers, about your job at the company, about where and who your boss is supporting or where they're at, all of that stuff becomes these larger than life stories that we create in our heads, and they lead to conflicts and misunderstandings that rarely get resolved, and careers are completely demolished in its wake. So when we reach this point, where we're hyperfixating on all this information that is constantly just flooding into our heads, frustration mounts as we realize that we often don't have the ability to control what we're concerned about, and we begin to look for ways to force change into our lives and into the lives of others. It becomes a reaction. It becomes a response to this feeling of overwhelming frustration that I am concerned about so many things. It has become so overwhelming, my sphere of concern, that it doesn't jive with what I'm feeling. Like I said earlier, we begin to have that loss of hope and belief that what we say and what we do matters. And so frustration builds and frustration builds. I don't have the control. What am I going to do? How am I going to control this? How do I change this? How do I make them change? And knowing all that we know warps how we communicate with each other when we get to that point. Because we try to use blunt force. We slip into these false dualities of choice. As I've explained here and in my TEDx talks, everything becomes lacking nuance, lacking context, lacking intricacy, and it all becomes right, wrong, good, bad, fair versus unfair, good versus evil, you're with us or you're against us. We look for ways to force change into our lives, into the lives of others. It becomes divisive language in this desperate attempt to grasp what is ultimately a false sense of control. We have all of this information coming into us, and it makes us believe, just because we have the information, that there's something we can do to control it. And I'm telling you, rare is the instance where you have the control. It is not as rare to have influence, yes, of course, but rare in these areas of concern do we have the ability to say, you know what? I don't agree with this. It now has to be this, and you all have to do what I say. If that person is your boss, they can say it because they have the title and they have the autonomy and authority to make that kind of a change. But let me ask, and I've asked this before, do you like to be told to change? Is that how we as humans think about change? Do we like to be forced? Do we like to be told it's a black or white, either or choice, and you have to make it and live with that decision for the rest of your life? No, we don't like that. And in fact, there's a phenomenon where we, of course, understand all that is going on in our head and the grace that we give ourselves. And in the very next breath, the grace that we do not extend to someone else in a similar circumstance, because we don't know the fullness of their thoughts and their mind and what they're thinking about and what they care about. We want that grace for ourselves, and yet we so rarely extend it to others because we get into this place of lacking authority to control what we are ultimately only concerned about. So when we do this, we push aside the nuance of ideas, the complexity of belief systems, the solutions to problems that have no clear-cut best choice. And when we communicate in this place, it crushes us. All conversations become divisive. They become, and I shouldn't say all, that's using extreme language. Many discussions become divisive. It becomes, you either have to give me this answer right here in this moment, and if it doesn't match up 100% with what I believe, then you are out of my life, or I'm going to scream at you or yell at you and tell you to change and tell you all the ways that you're wrong, and never take a step back and ask a question. Never take a step back and get curious about why somebody might believe that the way that they believe could have some nuance and complexity that I'm not seeing. One of my favorite questions is, what could I be missing? One of my second favorite question might be, what's my goal? When you can answer those two questions honestly and match them up with this circle of control, influence, and concern, things start to shift. When you say, what's my goal? Well, I want to get this person to change. They don't believe like I believe. I'm very certain how I believe and it's the right way. But what could I be missing? Well, I could be missing the ability to control that person. Sure. I could be missing the fullness of why they believe the way they believe. Okay. I could be missing a certain level of trust that would build up some influence in this person's life. I could be missing some context of their life experience that maybe this is how they grew up. And I'm fighting years of not only ingrained belief, but also a sense of belonging to their tribe, however you define that tribe. If you don't know that person and then you have not built the trust to be able to speak into their lives, no level of control that you have is going to change them anyway. Because ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, within the circle of control, you only have your thoughts, your reactions, your words, your choices, your actions. At best, you only ever have influence. And quite often, without the foundation of trust and knowing the complexity of who a person is, it's only a concern. And in that world, positive change can't happen through force. Now, when we communicate from a place of understanding what it is that we control and where we potentially have influence, the dynamics of relationships, and communication, they shift back to their intended and natural order. When you communicate with somebody, knowing and understanding what you control, only yourself, where you have influence, and that it is only influence, you're now beginning to operate in that circle of control, influence, and concern. In this world, in this way, friendships, relationships, they begin to regain some of their messy glory. If you recall, you would get in fights with your school friends in elementary school, usually over something that you wanted to control. I want to play this game on the playground. No, I want to play this game. Well, we're in a fight. We're not talking anymore. You eventually come back. Friendships are messy. Relationships are messy. We are human beings. We all have our biases. We all have the things that we want to control, the ways that we want it done from our perspective. They're messy. But if you remember Vikram Mancharamani, who was on this show a few episodes ago, he said that life changed for him when he realized that every perspective is biased, incomplete, and therefore limited, including your own perspective. And when you realize that and you align it with the circle of control, the circle of influence, and the circle of concern, that's where we begin to work within the right order of things. I've already mentioned friendships and relationships regaining their messy glory. When you do that, time is spent on producing productive outcomes because you know those can't be forced because you ultimately don't have control there. So you work for other ways where you can influence things. Your work and life become more fulfilling. And ultimately, you realize that what you say and do matters to those who mean the most to you, those you have influence over, not those that you have little to no control over, of course, but only those areas where you have concern. And that is the space where positive change occurs. I've seen it time and time again in the conversations that I've had on this show, in my interactions with people out in the world, that when that order is restored, positive things happen. Do they go exactly how people expect them to? Of course not, because they're out of their control. Is doing something better than nothing? Absolutely. In many instances, yes. Doing something is better than nothing. This is the work of a peacemaker, as I mentioned in my second TEDx talk. The work of going and creating peace rather than just sitting back, withdrawing and saying, I'm going to be concerned about all this stuff, but I'm not actually going to do anything about it. I'm not going to change my approach or my methods. I'm going to just wait for everybody to come eventually realize that I had it right all along. You're going to be waiting a long time, my friend, if that is the approach. It's a peacekeeper, and the peace isn't real. As I understand it, Stephen Covey wrote in Seven Habits that this circle of control, influence, and concern aligns with the habits that highly successful people do. This one happens to be being proactive. That highly effective people focus their time and energy on what they can control and influence rather than wasting it on unchangeable external circumstances, those things that they're concerned with. Being proactive, it encourages people to take initiative, to focus on their responses to situations rather than the situations themselves. When it comes to conflict, it encourages us to identify actual, actionable steps that we can take or that we can influence that can foster dialogue, constructive dialogue. You know, one of the things that you can control? Your curiosity, how many questions you ask. You can control your level of empathy. As Manu Meal said on the show, empathy, making people feel like they belong in that space with you, even when you disagree. And here's the thing. When you consistently focus on the circle of control, that innermost point, you can actually expand your circle of influence over time. All those things, family, friends, finances, work environment, health, voting. Heck, you can even move up to having a level of control about foreign politics if that's your goal. Like if your goal is to be on the world stage, by focusing on what you can control and understanding how influence happens and that it is not forced change, but dialogue with others, then you can eventually expand that influence into those areas and even perhaps control into those areas that you are concerned about. But it takes time and it takes protecting the relationship first. It also, to bring this back to the beginning, means reducing unnecessary information that is cluttering your ability to do so, that's filling your life with stress and uncontrollable concerns, things that you ultimately have no ability to affect. It takes time, it requires patience, but the end result is far worth it. Now, I'm not saying you have to go delete social media off your phone, but I am saying consider the information that you are taking in every single day and what you're doing with that information, how it's affecting how you think about your ability to control and influence the world around you for the better. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with someone else who you know, who might find some value in hearing me go on for the last, 30 minutes or so. I appreciate you. I appreciate you listening to this show. If you would ever like to get in touch with me, you can always email me at michael@rethinkingcommunication.com, or you can go to my website, michaelashford.com, and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of Rethinking Communication. And until then, keep asking questions.